Beneath the official histories of the Second World War lies a silence, an unspoken void where archives were sealed, testimonies were silenced, and evidence was consigned to the shadows. It is a silence that stretches not only across Europe's battlefields, but also across seas, forests, and forgotten prison camps, where the truth was too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The war was more than battles and treaties. It was a conflict of secrets, fought not just with tanks and rifles, but with coded transmissions, vanished documents, and the quiet disappearance of entire convoys and their crews. What survives today are fragments, scattered files marked classified, fading photographs with faces blacked out, and whispers that passed between intelligence officers who knew too much. Governments called it deniable, historians called it speculation, but those who witnessed the shadows never forgot. These mysteries were not lost through accident. They were buried by design, concealed beneath the rubble of empires that rose and fell in fire. We are left with questions that no tribunal ever answered. What was really aboard the convoys that never reached port? Who erased the names of scientists and officers from every record? Why did trains cross into Siberia under guard, never to emerge? The war ended in 1945, yet its most chilling secrets never saw daylight. Tonight, those long-suppressed files are unlocked, not to glorify victory, but to confront the silence that still lingers in the corridors of power, where shadows are thicker than truth and history itself feels unfinished. Chapter 1. The Ghost Convoy of the Baltic. The Baltic Sea in 1944 was no longer a secure German lake. Soviet submarines prowled its waters, Allied bombers stalked its harbors, and the once proud Kriegsmarine was reduced to desperate maneuvers, escorting convoys under the constant threat of attack. Yet buried within the surviving records of the Oberkommando der Marine lies the faintest trace of something anomalous, an operation codenamed Eisflamme, a convoy recorded in fragmented dispatches but absent from official post-war archives. The orders referenced ships departing from Gotenhafen, today known as Gdynia in Poland, in late September 1944. What they carried was never described in detail, only coded phrases like special cargo, priority alpha, and escort strength maximum. This was not coal, grain, or ordinary munitions. This was something that demanded absolute secrecy, guarded not only by the Kriegsmarine but also by detachments of the 11th Panzer Grenadier Division, men usually reserved for armoured warfare, not naval escort. Survivors recalled a peculiar loading process. Railway wagons, sealed, their contents hidden even from the dock workers, were rolled directly onto transport ships under SS supervision. The guards bore the insignia of the Totenkopfverbände, the same units that ran the concentration camps. Eyewitnesses, speaking years later to Soviet interrogators, described the mood as tense, even fearful. These were not ordinary troop or supply movements. The crates were marked with alphanumeric codes that matched no known German logistics system, and many carried a single Black Eagle stamp, not of the Wehrmacht, but of the Reich Main Security Office. When the convoy finally left port, it sailed not in daylight, but under the cover of a moonless night. Its escorts ordered to maintain radio silence at all costs. Soviet records show that submarines of the Baltic Fleet intercepted multiple vessels near the Gulf of Finland in October of that year. Reports from Stuka-class submarines claimed at least 2 confirmed sinkings, yet when divers returned decades later to examine the wrecks, something disturbing emerged. Hull plates had been stripped clean of identification numbers. Ships' bells, brass plaques, and any material that might confirm the vessel's origin had been deliberately removed. In their place were gaping holes, as though salvage teams had reached them long before, extracting not only the cargo, but also every trace of its existence. Official Soviet communique announced successful sinkings, yet the internal NKVD files admitted confusion. There was no confirmation of manifests, no names of ships that should have been there. The British Admiralty also took notice. File ADM 22341, declassified only in part during the 1970s, recorded unexplained radiological spikes in waters off Gotland in late 1944. At the time, radiation monitoring was primitive, but the anomaly was logged nonetheless, marked with the cautionary phrase, possible contamination, source undetermined. What connection, if any, existed between those readings and the missing convoy remains uncertain. Still, some within naval intelligence speculated that Eisflamme may have involved components of Germany's stalled atomic program. perhaps uranium oxide shipments, perhaps even experimental warheads intended to slow the Soviet advance. Yet no evidence of completed devices has ever been recovered, and the official history insists Germany was far from such capability. The testimonies of German survivors further complicate the story. In scattered post-war interrogations, several sailors spoke of strict orders never to enter the cargo decks. Others described guards opening crates at sea, revealing objects wrapped in heavy lead-lined casings, loaded onto lifeboats when the danger of interception grew. One survivor mentioned that SS officers ordered barrels rolled overboard near the island of Bornholm before their ship went down, barrels that sank quickly and were never recovered. Danish fishermen later reported dead fish and strange slicks in the same waters, observations quietly collected by Allied officers but never pursued further. When the Cold War began, interest in the ghost convoy did not fade. The KGB maintained files on it until at least the late 1960s, suspecting that Western powers may have retrieved some of the cargo. Rumors circulated that American salvage vessels, operating under the guise of commercial diving, scoured the Baltic in the 1950s. German sources whispered that Operation Paperclip may have encompassed more than scientists. It may have included materials recovered from the depths, materials that no government has ever acknowledged possessing. If true, this would mean that the sea did not swallow the convoy completely. Instead, its legacy was divided among victors who swore never to reveal the full truth. The physical evidence is scarce, yet fragments remain. A Soviet diver's report from 1952, long hidden in archives near Leningrad, described entering a wreck that contained containers emitting strong heat. His team was ordered to withdraw, and the site was sealed with explosives. Later, when Western divers returned after the fall of the Soviet Union, they found only twisted metal, no trace of cargo. Swedish intelligence, in turn, reported unusual naval activity around Gotland in the early 1990s, as Russian vessels revisited old sites under the pretext of environmental surveys. No samples were ever released to the public, and the Baltic remains one of the most contaminated seas on Earth, though official explanations cite only industrial runoff. To this day, the ships of Iceflam remain unacknowledged in German naval lists. Their hull numbers do not appear in war diaries, their names absent from loss registries, as if entire vessels had been erased from the record. Historians argue over whether this was a deliberate purge ordered by Admiral Dönitz or a later Cold War manipulation of archives. Yet the fact remains, survivors existed, fragments of testimony survived, and intercepted signals proved that something sailed those waters under the black veil of secrecy. If nothing was there, why erase so much? Why destroy evidence, silence witnesses, and strip wrecks bare? The ghost convoy of the Baltic is not remembered in memorials or textbooks. It drifts instead in the uneasy silence between nations. A story neither confirmed nor denied. Too dangerous to claim, too persistent to erase. Whatever cargo it carried, nuclear material, secret weapons, or human prisoners, the truth remains buried beneath the waves, guarded by layers of lies that stretch from the last days of the Third Reich to the shadow games of the Cold War. In the end, the only certainty is that ships once sailed under the name Iceflam, and their story was never meant to be known. Chapter 2: Operation Eclipse and the Vanished Scientists. May 1945 was meant to be the end. Allied columns pushed into Bavaria, the Reich collapsing under the relentless pressure of two armies advancing from east and west. Yet as German cities fell and surrender documents were signed, something else unfolded in silence. Within the ruins of Nazi Germany's most secret facilities, Allied forces found not only weapons, but men, scientists and engineers who had worked on projects far beyond conventional warfare. And in the chaos of those final days, a select number of these men disappeared, their names erased from every prisoner list, their fates sealed under the codename Operation Eclipse. The operation itself was no myth. It was conceived as part of the Allied strategy to divide and secure occupied Germany, targeting communications, infrastructure, and high-value research centers before the Soviets could reach them. Among those targets was the Ohrdruf complex, an extension of Buchenwald concentration camp. Officially described as an ammunition storage site, Ohrdruf's subterranean tunnels told another story. When US troops of the 89th Infantry Division entered in April 1945, they discovered abandoned laboratories, half-dismantled machinery, and documents stamped Kernversuch, nuclear experiment. What they did not find were the 27 physicists and engineers listed in captured rosters. Their names appeared once, then vanished entirely. OSS cables from the same period, some preserved in the National Archives, reference special detainees being transported by night through Alsace. The language is deliberately vague, speaking of priority transfers not to be reported to higher command. At the same time, Soviet Smersh units intercepted convoys near Thuringia carrying men under false identities, guarded as tightly as any war criminal. Yet when Red Army intelligence cross-referenced these prisoners with existing lists, the names did not match. Survivors of the camp system remembered educated men being separated from general populations, loaded onto trucks, and driven away under SS escort just days before liberation. No trace of them was ever found. The missing scientists were not ordinary academics. Among them, according to fragments from confiscated SS files, were specialists in reactor design, isotope separation, and high-energy physics, fields critical to atomic weapons research. Germany had lagged far behind in the nuclear race, but it had accumulated valuable knowledge. Men like Kurt Diebner and Werner Heisenberg survived the war and fell into Allied hands, their work documented. But what of those 27 names? Patton's staff wrote in correspondence with London of detainees requiring maximum discretion, not to be acknowledged under Geneva Protocol. These were men who never appeared at Nuremberg, never surfaced in post-war universities, and never appeared in Soviet show trials. They simply ceased to exist. Theories surrounding their fate diverge sharply. Some historians suggest they were quietly absorbed into Operation Paperclip, the secret program that funneled German scientists into American laboratories. Others argue that they may have been executed to prevent their capture by rival powers. But buried in the CIA's early Cold War files lies a more unsettling possibility. A memorandum from 1949 refers cryptically to assets originating from Eclipse designation, Eclipse 27. The context suggests ongoing use, not disposal. If true, then these vanished men may have lived under new names, working in silence, their existence classified far beyond ordinary security clearance. The Soviets were no less active. In captured NKVD records, one report from June 1945 describes a convoy of prisoners intercepted near Chemnitz. The officer noted that the detainees spoke in technical jargon, discussed uranium enrichment, and resisted interrogation. Yet the convoy was diverted westward before it could be secured. Stalin himself complained bitterly in Politburo sessions about the disappearance of German specialists, accusing the British and Americans of deception. His frustration was evident in later Soviet efforts to secure their own nuclear experts, often kidnapping or coercing men from occupied territories. The race for atomic supremacy was not only about technology, it was about people, and those people were currency more valuable than gold. At Ohrdruf, the tunnels told a silent story. Survivors recalled slave laborers forced to move massive equipment into underground chambers, machinery they did not understand. Engineers sketched by memory spoke of centrifuges, heavy water tanks and shielding walls coated in lead. When the Allies secured the site, they found only remnants, yet the documents pointed to advanced research. Was it incomplete, or had it been moved in time? If it was moved, who directed the relocation, and where did it end up? The missing scientists fit neatly into this puzzle. Experts who could rebuild the program elsewhere under new masters. The British had their own agenda. In the archives at Kew, documents from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee include references to special handling of detainees taken from Bavaria in May 1945. These files, heavily redacted, confirm the transfer of unnamed prisoners to facilities in the south of England, where they were housed separately from other POWs. RAF aircraft manifests from the same period list unusual flights from Stuttgart to airfields near Oxford, flights that carried no standard troops or cargo. Official explanations describe them as intelligence transfers, but nothing more. American intelligence was equally cautious. In a now declassified State Department briefing, one sentence stands out. Certain German specialists remain unacknowledged due to the sensitivity of their prior engagements. The phrasing suggests more than omission, it implies deliberate concealment. These were not meant to be paraded as trophies of victory. They were ghosts to be hidden, their knowledge too valuable to share and too dangerous to expose. The moral implications were staggering. If these scientists had indeed participated in human experimentation or slave labor at Ohrdruf, their quiet assimilation into Allied programs represented not only a strategic decision, but a moral compromise of the highest order. Testimonies from forced laborers described horrific conditions, experiments with radiation exposure, and deaths from untreated burns. To silence these accounts by erasing the men responsible would be an act of historical erasure, trading justice for technological advantage. Yet the silence held. No tribunal ever named these scientists, no archive ever listed their trials, and no memorial ever recorded their existence. The trail grows cold in the late 1940s, as Cold War secrecy hardened into permanent classification. A handful of rumors persisted among émigré communities in South America, where whispers spoke of German scientists arriving under false papers, their pasts scrubbed clean. Others pointed to unexplained research facilities in Nevada and New Mexico, where men with heavy accents worked behind closed doors. None of this has ever been confirmed, and official denials remain firm. But the fragments left behind, OSS cables, missing rosters, unexplained air transfers, form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Operation Eclipse began as a military campaign, a plan to seize German territory before the Soviets. But within its shadow grew another operation, one never acknowledged by name. It was a hunt for knowledge, a race to control the minds and hands that had shaped Germany's most secret weapons projects. 27 men entered the historical record in April 1945. By May, they were gone. Not killed, not captured, but vanished, absorbed into a silence as deep as any bunker. Their absence is as haunting as their presence might have been, a void in the archives that speaks louder than words. What remains is the echo of their disappearance, a reminder that victory in 1945 was not the end of secrets, but the beginning of a new war fought in shadows, where truth itself became classified. Chapter 3: The Katyn Silence and Missing Files. In the spring of 1943, when German forces advancing through the Smolensk region uncovered mass graves in the Katyn forest, the world was confronted with one of the darkest atrocities of the Second World War. Thousands of Polish officers, their hands bound and bullets lodged at the base of their skulls, lay buried beneath the pines. The Germans immediately broadcast their discovery, seeking to fracture the uneasy alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Berlin's propaganda ministry trumpeted the massacre as evidence of Bolshevik barbarity. Moscow, in turn, denounced the revelation as an elaborate Nazi fabrication, accusing the Wehrmacht of planting the bodies. Yet when the guns of the war fell silent 2 years later, the truth of Katyn was not brought into daylight. It was sealed deliberately, buried beneath layers of deception that reached from Stalin's Kremlin to Roosevelt's White House and Churchill's War Cabinet. In the shadows of archives and behind closed tribunal doors, the massacre of Poland's officer corps was not forgotten, but it was silenced. The Polish Home Army had already known of these disappearances. Reports smuggled to London described how thousands of men, captured in 1939 during the joint German-Soviet invasion, had been transported eastward into camps run by the NKVD. Kozelsk, Starobelsk, Ostashkov. These were the names whispered by wives and families who received letters until the spring of 1940, when correspondence ceased. Official Soviet assurances claimed the men had been released or transferred. But by 1943, their fate lay beneath Katyn's soil. When the Germans unearthed the first bodies, each corpse carried evidence that pointed not to 1941, when the Soviets claimed the Germans were responsible, but to 1940 when the Red Army still controlled the region. Documents, diaries, and newspapers dated to that spring were found in the pockets of the dead, their final possessions preserved in the damp earth. The Germans convened an international medical commission to inspect the graves. Forensic experts from occupied Europe concluded that the killings had occurred before the Wehrmacht entered Smolensk. Their reports, archived in Berlin and seized by the Allies after the war, spoke of advanced decomposition consistent with bodies buried in 1940. Yet when these same files surfaced at Nuremberg, they were presented not as evidence of Soviet guilt, but as German propaganda. The tribunal, under political pressure, refused to examine Katyn in depth. A sanitized version of events was read into the record, one that maintained the fragile wartime unity of the Allies, even at the cost of truth. Justice was sacrificed to politics, and Katyn was consigned to silence. Soviet archives tell a parallel story. one written in coded orders and missing files. In March 1940, Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, submitted a memorandum to Stalin proposing the execution of Polish prisoners as hardened enemies of Soviet power. The Politburo approved the plan. Orders flowed down the chain of command, instructing NKVD officers to prepare lists of detainees for special handling. These lists, numbering over 20,000 men, became death sentences. Yet after 1945, when Western intelligence sought to reconstruct the fate of Poland's missing officers, many of these documents had vanished. Entire shipments of Polish files were removed from Warsaw archives by NKVD units during the Soviet occupation. What remained were gaps, missing pages, falsified rosters, and redacted names. Among the erasures were senior officers who had worked closely with British and French intelligence before the war, men whose knowledge of Soviet operations would have been invaluable had they survived. Within MI6, fragments of truth were preserved in secrecy. Katyn File 7C, sealed until the 1970s, contained aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by the Royal Air Force in 1942. These images showed burial mounds consistent with mass graves long before the Germans announced their discovery. British analysts knew the implications. The Soviets had executed the officers in 1940, and the graves had been there ever since. Yet this file was locked away, inaccessible to the public, hidden even from many within the intelligence community. The political necessity of maintaining alliance with Moscow outweighed the duty to reveal the truth. American records show a similar suppression. In 1951, the US Congress established a committee to investigate the Katyn massacre. Witnesses testified, evidence was gathered, and the conclusion was clear. The Soviets bore responsibility. Yet even then, key documents remained classified, buried under Cold War agreements. Roosevelt's wartime decision to ignore reports from his own diplomats and military attachés was not reversed. The silence held, stretching across decades, maintained by those who feared the consequences of reopening old wounds. The missing files are perhaps the most haunting aspect of Katyn. In Polish archives, officer lists abruptly end with unexplained gaps. Names of men last seen alive in NKVD custody disappear without trace. Families received no death certificates, no official acknowledgement, only silence. Among the missing were intelligence officers, cryptographers, and men with deep ties to Allied networks in Europe. Their absence suggests more than random execution. It suggests a targeted purge, the deliberate elimination of those who might resist Soviet control of post-war Poland. By erasing both the men and the paper trail, Moscow sought to eliminate not just individuals, but the memory of an independent Polish state. The silence continued even after Stalin's death. Khrushchev, despite denouncing some of Stalin's crimes, refused to acknowledge Soviet responsibility for Katyn. It was not until 1990, under Gorbachev, that the Soviet Union officially admitted the NKVD had carried out the massacre. By then, decades had passed, and many of the original witnesses were dead. Yet even then, not all files were released. Researchers who entered Russian archives in the 1990s found evidence of tampering, with documents missing or heavily redacted. Some files bore signs of deliberate removal, entire volumes gone without record. The most sensitive lists, those linking the executions to specific orders and commanders, remain classified or destroyed. The emotional weight of Katyn is carried not only in archives, but in the voices of survivors. Wives who waited decades for answers, children who grew old without knowing where their fathers lay, soldiers who returned from Siberia only to learn their comrades had been buried in secret. Their testimonies echo through history, reminders of a crime that governments chose to forget. For them, the silence was not an abstract matter of diplomacy. It was a wound that never closed. The Katyn massacre is not merely a tragedy of numbers. It is a story of deliberate erasure, of truth suppressed to protect alliances and geopolitical balance. It reveals the lengths to which states will go to control history, to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. And it leaves us with questions that still linger. Who else was erased from those lists? What secrets did they carry that made their deaths necessary? And how many more files remain hidden, locked away in vaults, waiting for the moment when silence can no longer be sustained? In the end, Katyn is not just a graveyard in a forest. It is a symbol of suppressed truth, a reminder that even in the age of total war, the most dangerous battles are fought not with bullets, but with silence. The massacre was not only an act of execution, it was an act of disappearance, and its missing files are as chilling as the bodies beneath the pines. Chapter 4: The Siberian Train of shadows. In the winter of 1945, as the Reich disintegrated and the Red Army swept westward, eyewitnesses in East Prussia and occupied Manchuria whispered of a train unlike any other. It was no ordinary military transport, guarded by SS detachments drawn from the Ahnennerbe, the secretive research arm of Himmler's Schutzstaffel. The train was loaded with sealed crates marked only with the Reichsadler and the cryptic word Kultur. Its departure point, according to fragmentary German rail logs, was Königsberg. Its destination, if NKVD reports are to be believed, was deep inside Soviet-controlled Siberia. The convoy carried no civilians, no ordinary cargo, and its manifest, unlike standard Wehrmacht shipments, was handwritten, without duplicates, and sealed by Reich Main Security Office officials. The movement bore the codename Operation Bellabor, a word that never appears in German post-war archives but survives in scattered Soviet intelligence files. When Red Army units advancing through Manchuria intercepted the train near Chita, the reports filed by local commanders were terse. They recorded a heavily armed escort, German officers who spoke fluent Russian, and cargo locked in armored vault wagons that defied immediate inspection. The Soviets, accustomed to capturing weapons, supplies and prisoners, noted something unprecedented, an insistence from higher command that the train be rerouted under maximum secrecy. Smersh operatives, Stalin's counterintelligence elite, took over the convoy within hours. From that moment, the train vanished from official records. No mention of its arrival in Moscow, no registration in Lubyanka archives, no further trace. To this day, its fate is recorded only in whispers. A Siberian train of shadows, absorbed into the Soviet interior without explanation. Captured German officers later spoke of what the train contained. Under interrogation, some claimed it carried Ahnennerbe collections, archaeological finds looted from Tibet, Greece, and the Middle East. Others suggested experimental blueprints, weapons research far ahead of its time. One SS officer described lead-lined crates so heavy they required special reinforced wagons, guarded at all times by armed men under orders to shoot intruders on sight. Another testified that among the cargo were coded maps and ancient objects of power, though such language may have been designed to confuse or exaggerate under duress. Yet the consistent detail was secrecy. The cargo was not to be touched, not to be inventoried, not even to be acknowledged. Orders came directly from Berlin, signed by Himmler himself, demanding absolute compliance. For decades, the Soviet Union denied the existence of such a transport. Yet after 1991, when fragments of NKVD and Smersh archives were briefly opened, researchers uncovered scattered references to Bellabor. These included a communique noting priority foreign cargo secured, November 1945, and a follow-up order for the transfer of sealed wagons to a classified rail spur near Novosibirsk. Beyond that, nothing. The files were missing, destroyed, or perhaps never catalogued. Russian archivists who accessed them reported entire sections of wartime transport registers blacked out, page numbers skipped, and entries marked only with the word special. Whatever was aboard the train, it was absorbed into the Soviet state with a silence rivaling that of Katyn. The mystery deepens with testimonies from locals. Villagers near Chita recalled seeing German prisoners unloading crates under heavy guard. Some spoke of strange symbols painted on the boxes, runes, swastikas, and markings not used in standard Wehrmacht supply chains. Others remembered Soviet soldiers posting perimeter guards, barring all civilians from approaching the rail lines for days. And then, just as suddenly, the train was gone, steaming eastward into the frozen wilderness. For those who lived nearby, it was as if the earth itself had swallowed the convoy. Western intelligence tracked the rumors closely. MI6 reports from 1946, declassified only in fragments, refer to a German train captured intact, believed to contain classified material of unknown value. American OSS cables noted unusual Soviet activity around Siberian rail hubs, with entire zones declared off-limits even to local Communist Party officials. Analysts speculated whether the cargo related to Germany's advanced weapons programs, rocketry, nuclear research, or chemical warfare. Others pointed to the Ahnennerbe's obsession with esoteric relics, arguing that the Soviets may have inherited more than science from the Reich. Whatever the truth, the Allies were shut out. The train and its contents belonged to Stalin now, and silence was enforced with ruthless precision. There are modern echoes, In 1992, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian journalists reported on a restricted area near Krasnoyarsk, where military engineers were said to be dismantling old underground vaults. Local workers spoke anonymously of crates bearing swastikas, discovered during renovations of a sealed depot. Photographs allegedly existed but vanished before publication. Later that same year, Russian security services reclassified the entire site as a closed military zone. In the years since, rumors of the Siberian train have circulated among treasure hunters, historians and intelligence veterans alike, each theory more unsettling than the last. Some believe the train carried looted art, the remnants of Europe's plundered museums. Others insist it contained experimental technology, early jet engines, prototypes of guided missiles, or even fragments of atomic research that eluded the Allies. The most controversial theory suggests the train held human cargo, prisoners of special significance, scientists or witnesses too valuable to leave behind. If so, their fate remains as obscure as the cargo itself, hidden in camps that never appeared on maps, silenced by a regime that excelled in erasure. What is certain is this: trains leave records. Locomotives, wagons, fuel allotments, schedules, all were meticulously documented by both German and Soviet bureaucracies. Yet in this case, the paperwork is missing, deliberately excised from archives that remain otherwise intact. The absence itself is evidence, pointing to a cover-up of the highest order. The Siberian train of shadows did not vanish by accident. It was made to disappear, erased, as though it never existed. The story lingers because it embodies the intersection of two great totalitarian powers at the twilight of war. A Reich desperate to protect its most precious secrets, a Soviet Union eager to seize them, and an Allied world left in the dark. The crates marked Kultur may have held nothing more than stolen paintings, or they may have contained the fragments of knowledge that shaped the Cold War balance of power. Until the sealed vaults of Russian archives are opened fully, if they ever are, the train will remain a ghost on the rails of history, a shadow convoy bound for Siberia, carrying a cargo the world was never meant to see. History is never silent, it is silenced. The files we have examined, from the Baltic convoys erased from the sea to the vanished scientists of Bavaria, from the silenced graves of Katyn to the train that steamed into the Siberian night, all point to one truth: the Second World War did not end in 1945, it transformed. It shifted from open conflict to hidden struggles, where the spoils of war were not only land and power, but knowledge, secrecy, and silence itself. Each of these mysteries was not forgotten by chance. They were deliberately concealed, locked away in archives, and guarded by governments who understood their explosive potential. Radiation readings buried in Admiralty reports, prisoner rosters erased from Allied files, photographs sealed in intelligence vaults, train manifests blacked out in Soviet ledgers. Each fragment is a piece of a puzzle that remains unsolved. What binds them all is absence. Ships that never existed, men who never returned, documents that no longer appear. And yet, in that very absence, the outlines of truth become visible. These are not stories of myth, but of suppression, of facts too dangerous to be admitted even decades later. The war ended, but its shadows remain. In those shadows, we glimpse the unfinished history of a world still shaped by secrets, still haunted by unanswered questions. And so the silence endures, not because the evidence is gone, but because someone, somewhere, still wants it buried.